Christmas Day of 1776 was not merry for George Washington and his army. The war was not going well. Except for a few small isolated victories, Washington's campaign against the British consisted mostly of retreats, defeats, and narrow escapes. There was little money to buy supplies for the army, and even less money to pay the soldiers. The British and their Hessian allies seemed to be holding all the cards. The British had the world's most powerful army and navy. British and Hessian troops were well equipped, well trained, and well supplied. The British Empire reached into nearly every corner of the world, from southern Asia to North America, to Australia, to the Caribbean Sea. British armies conquered the indigenous peoples, exacted tribute, established trade, and mostly kept the peace. Though very wealthy, Great Britain did not have population enough to field an army large enough to police so many parts of the world. The leader of the British Empire, King George III, used family connections and was able to hire soldiers from certain princes in Germany. Many of these soldiers were from the area around Frankfurt, Hesse Kassel, and Hesse Darmstadt. These professional soldiers, called Hessians, were often forced into the army. They were not well paid, earning only 25 cents a day. But they were well trained, had a fearsome reputation, and generally they were very loyal to King George III and the British cause. Washington had to make a desperate gamble. He knew that the enlistment of most of his troops was almost done. In less than a week, most of his soldiers would be able to leave the army and go home. Because the army was very discouraged, it appeared the only chance the American Revolution had for success was to gain some sort of victory, and to do it quickly. Washington spotted an opportunity. He saw that the British were attempting to hold the territory along the Delaware River with a string of outposts. Several of these outposts were manned by the Hessians. Washington had about 5,000 men at his command. He found out through his spies that at Trenton, New Jersey, there were 3 regiments of Hessians, numbering about 1,500 troops. Washington planned a surprise attack. He knew that the Hessians would not expect to fight a battle during a blizzard. 18th century armies rarely fought in the wintertime, preferring to stay warm indoors. Washington also knew that Christmas was a much more celebrated holiday in Germany than it was in America. Washington figured that the Hessians would be partying on Christmas. The commander at Trenton was a German colonel named Johann Rall. Oberst Rall and some of the British commanders in the region were concerned that Trenton could be vulnerable to an attack. It was suggested to build barricades for defense, but with the weather as fierce as it was, there was no real sense of urgency. In order to attack Trenton, Washington would have to cross the Delaware River. Because the river was clogged with ice, this was a very dangerous undertaking. Fortunately, Washington had some excellent boatmen who were up to the task. The crossing was completed by 3 in the morning. Although only 2,500 Americans were able to cross the river late that Christmas night, they did manage to bring along 18 cannons. Washington was reported to have cried when he saw that he was able to track the course of his army by the bloody footprints in the snow. In the early morning of December 26, Washington sent some of his German-speaking men ahead to stop anyone traveling to or from Trenton. A civilian loyalist spotted Washington's army and managed to make his way to Trenton. He was able to get a note to the Hessians warning of the Americans' approach.
The Americans are coming tonight. Ich weiß nicht. Wissens. Ich weiß nicht. Ach, morgen.
Washington's spies had assured Raleigh that the Americans lacked shoes, clothing, food, and gunpowder. Raleigh was certain that the Americans were unable to mount any serious threat to his 3 regiments. These 3 regiments were named Lossberg, Kniphausen, and Raleigh. 50 German riflemen called Jägers and about 20 British horsemen called Dragoons were also stationed at Trenton. What was this? A party of about 50 armed men were seen coming toward the Continental Army. These men had just conducted a small raid and had fired on the Hessians in Trenton. Washington was very upset about this.
Hello, General Washington. Hello. We just finished raiding the Hessians in Trenton. If you ruin my surprise attack, I'll hang you by your toes.
Actually, the little raid helped Washington to keep his surprise. Some of the Hessians expected there could be a fight with the Americans, and they thought the tiny raid was all there was to it. The total distance the Americans had to march from the crossing of the Delaware to Trenton was about 8 miles. When they were about 3 miles from Trenton, Washington split his army into 2 columns. He sent about half of his force under General John Sullivan to take the road by the river, and Washington himself accompanied General Nathanael Greene's men towards Trenton by an inland road. An American officer said to Washington,
General Washington, General Sullivan says all the gunpowder's wet. Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton.
Washington ordered his officers to synchronize their watches. The attack was to begin 1 hour before daylight. But the Americans were several hours behind schedule. It was already becoming light. At about 8 in the morning, the Americans began to infiltrate the town. The Hessians made an attempt to retake their cannons with a bayonet charge, but this attack was quickly broken up by American musket fire and cannons firing grape shot. Finding that the bridge to escape Trenton had already been taken by General Sullivan's Continentals, the Hessians fell back to an orchard to regroup.
We're supposed to be ready.
Colonel Rahl was mortally wounded by cannon fire, and his men finally surrendered. Concerned that the British would launch a powerful counterattack to free the captured Hessians, Washington moved quickly to take his prisoners for safekeeping back across the Delaware. Of the 1,500 Hessians stationed in Trenton, only 400 to 500 were able to escape over the bridge. Washington inflicted over 100 casualties on them and took nearly 900 prisoners. Washington did not lose a single soldier in the battle itself, although 2 of his men froze to death on the march to Trenton. A British officer said, upon hearing of the capture of the 3 Hessian regiments at Trenton, "I wouldn't have believed that all of the rebels in America could have captured that brigade." The Battle of Trenton was a critical victory at a critical moment in the Revolutionary War. It was the first time Washington had really won a battle. Many American soldiers were encouraged by the victory and with the promise of a $10 bounty to re-enlist, most of them stayed in the Army. Many long years of hardship and sacrifice lay ahead for Washington and his band of ragged scarecrows. The goal of these people was to live in a brand new country with new ideals and opportunities, to achieve basic rights, and maybe there would even be a chance to choose their own leaders. The dedication of these soldiers to the cause of liberty eventually led to the creation of a new nation, the United States of America.